Maria Snegovaya from the Center for European Policy Analysis, and she's also at Virginia Tech, joins us now from Washington. Hi, Maria.
Hello, Dana.
Maria is a brilliant analyst, and I think you've just written really a terrific, insightful piece for Newsweek. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's very interesting because a lot of the take on Alexei Navalny and the poisoning has been, well, Russia's done it before, they've done it again. And you say that Putin's regime, quote, because I'm stealing your words now, is transforming into a new, more repressive type of dictatorship than before, that this transformation is manifest an intensified wave of repression against opposition politicians and opinion leaders, unprecedented even by Russia's own standards. Why is it unprecedented? In what way?
Yeah, thank you, Dana, and I appreciate your interest in my article. I would love to get it correct, but unfortunately, the perception is not really only my own. A lot of people in Russia feel the same way.
Well, you get some credit. Take credit for it.
Okay. After the constitutional amendments have been passed this July, the regime really seems to have embraced some sense of impunity. There was essentially, Putin has extended his staying power for at least 12 more years, de jure, de facto almost indefinitely now, because the amendments were passed in complete violations of any rules and laws, whatever.
You know, while people were dealing with the pandemic and COVID-19 in Europe and in America, there was a referendum, and he's now extended his term until 2036, and there were all sorts of voting irregularities on a massive scale.
So yeah, absolutely, it's understandable why this happened. So the moment was chosen correctly, and the regime and Putin himself is quite good in picking moments. For example, he started the 2008 war in Georgia, was started by the Kremlin during the Olympic Games, right? Again, to distract attention, and similarly, something similar has happened in Ukraine as well. So in this sense, the way these amendments have been passed and the very little response and resistance these changes have received from Russian population domestically and from the international community seems to have shifted something in the perception of the reality by the Kremlin. And yes, of course, it's not the first time.
It seems to have shifted something in the perception of reality by the Kremlin. What does that mean?
They just think they're now convinced that at least up until the poison Navalny, it seems that they become convinced that they can do anything with very little repercussions and consequences. And it's true, as I said, essentially they're now in power forever. So who is to stop them from doing what they want to, right? Is it the West that's divided, polarized, and weakened by its own internal fractures? Or is it domestic Russian population that's repressed, fearful, also, by the way, heavily prosecuted with the fines? Navalny team, for example, still repaying the fines they've been charged with last year when the large mass protests erupted in Moscow last summer. So in this sense, yeah, they seem to be feeling the same. And of course, as with any thug, if a thug goes unpunished, for a while, then a thug becomes emboldened. And unfortunately, the current Kremlin elites, they do have this thuggish mentality. It's been said before. So what's new about Navalny, just to answer your question, right? It's true that unfortunately, the Kremlin's critics and opponents have been killed before. The most notorious example is the shooting on Boris Nemtsov in 2015, one of the opposition leaders as well. But
I knew Boris Nemtsov, and for people that don't know Boris Nemtsov, he was an amazing man. He was deputy prime minister at one point in Russia under Yeltsin, and then he became an opposition leader because he felt democracy was crumbling in Russia, and he ran for mayor in Sochi. He did many different things, and he opposed the invasion of Ukraine and Russia's seizure of Crimea, but he was shot multiple times in front of the Kremlin, in front of video cameras that just were conveniently switched off by the Kremlin that night.
Yeah, what an accident, right? All the cameras switched off. It's true. And the great thing, by the way, about Boris, who I also knew, is essentially he had power, he had access, right? He potentially had a possibility to live quite nicely under this regime because he had connections on the very top, and he decided willfully to abandon all of that for the sake of future democratic Russia as he imagined it to be. That is something that very few people are able to do, unfortunately, in Russia. Navalny is another example of very courageous, brave man. But the difference here, at least the way it's perceived in Russia, is that at least with Nemtsov's murder, there was certain confusion about who exactly ordered it. We suspect that the connections go up to Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of Chechen Republic. But to what extent Putin himself, personally wanted that is a little bit questionable. There were all kind of theories.
Some people have drawn parallels with that. They've said, in Putin's Russia now, people sometimes will act in Putin's interest, not necessarily with Putin's blessing. But you think in this case of Navalny, absolutely he would have had to verbally pull the trigger and say yes.
And the reason is, the proof in my eyes is the fact that Navalny has remained relatively immune. Relatively, it's important to highlight, for a decade, right? He's been quite dangerous and annoying to the Kremlin for quite a while. Navalny is probably the most effective political leader in Russia over Russia's recent history. He's been able to create a whole chain of his offices throughout Russia without being officially allowed into Russia's political system, which is absolutely amazing. His corruption investigation are extremely popular. His media resource is one of the highest among Russia's public figures and personalities. Mm-hmm. And of course, his smart voting campaign was very successful, as back in 2011.
But why now?
Right now, by the way, why now? Why was he murdered now? Yeah, and by the way, last thing that implicates Kremlin is, of course, the use of Novichok. This is the sort of substance that can only be elaborated at the very top level with access. Very few officials have access to it. So why now? I think that's precisely the constitutional amendments and the overall sort of apathy that has spread in the Russian society. Notice how even Navalny's poisoning, again, quite unprecedented even by Russia's own standards, has not led Russians in the streets. So it's important to keep in mind that the Kremlin banned mass protest under pretext of the pandemic and public health. And there's also huge fines that follow if people violate these regulations. As I mentioned before, back in 2019, the fines were huge, and a lot of opposition leaders still have to repay those. And so I think they realized that it's a perfect moment, and Russia's society seems to again become less interested in politics, disengaged, and the West is also distracted. And of course, there's also a fear of something like Belarus happening in Russia, because of course Russians watch Belarus.
I was going to ask you. I mean, clearly, a lot of people are saying that the street is on fire in Belarus against Lukashenko. The Kremlin shudders, worrying about that spreading, and Alexei Navalny would be potentially the one to set the match and get it going in Russia.
Navalny has developed a smart voting strategy that worked really nicely last year in Moscow Duma election. The idea is that to get the protest vote united against the strongest candidate who runs against the Kremlin candidate. And in 2019 Moscow elections last year, even if many independent candidates were not allowed to run by the Kremlin, still the opposition, thanks to Navalny, managed to unite around alternative candidates, and these alternative candidates backed by Navalny's campaign took almost half of Moscow Duma. This has not happened in the past, and was a really big blow to Putin and the Kremlin, because a lot of Kremlin-backed, very important people who negotiated on the very top failed to make it into the Duma. So the elections are not free and fair by any
Russian parliament, for people that don't know.
The Moscow Parliament, although the Moscow level, the Moscow region. So in this year, on September 13, Russia holds another round of elections countrywide, and Navalny team has been working very actively to spread this Moscow success in other regions, especially in Novosibirsk, which is the third most important, the third largest city in Moscow. But Navalny's teammates, like Vladimir Milov, say that what even more important is that right now Navalny has been really testing the strategy ahead of Moscow Duma election. This is the federal level parliamentary elections that are scheduled to take place in 2021. Maybe they will be scheduled a little bit earlier. And the Kremlin is really afraid that if Navalny is successfully able to mobilize people in the regions, and he already showed that he's successful in Moscow, this can turn out very bad for the Kremlin. So given that this is a perfect moment where the population is quite, as I said, disengaged politically, everyone is repressed and afraid of fines, and the constitutional amendments essentially now allow Putin to stay in power indefinitely. This is a perfect pretext, to implement all kind of bad repressions against the Kremlin's political opponents. Navalny, by the way, is not just the only person who has suffered under this wave of repressions. This is just the most notorious example, but there's also a number of Navalny's teammates who are beaten up and attacked in Russia's regions. Today there was a news about an attack on independent candidates who run in municipal elections as well. There's also increased charges. Some of the opposition candidates face criminal charges for organizing independent opposition rallies. So it's just the wave of repressions has definitely escalated in August. It's very visible.
If you're a repressive regime, and you have this great psychological sense of invincibility now that you talk about, why doesn't this work? And why not just continue and do more? And it will grow unless what?
Well, I think what is very encouraging, a small, beam of light in this darkness, is the response of the international community. Somehow the response has been less pronounced in case of Belarus than I hoped. But Navalny's poisoning seems to sort of kind of hit some kind of trigger. And we are really right now hearing unprecedented statement by world leaders like Angela Merkel. G7 just earlier today really issued a very powerful announcement. Even Francois Macron, who tried to be friends with Putin, now has to refrain. And it seems that certain type of international joint action is inevitable in this sense. So that
may be sanctions, but you know what my next question is going to be.
Yeah, well, sanctions don't work, do they?
My next question is going to be, with all this condemnation, President Trump, the most powerful country, has been completely absent from this, and he has refused to condemn Putin. And a lot of people think that it's just unbelievable that, there have been some statements from other people in the US administration, but President Trump has not come out and condemned the poisoning of Navalny and demanded really much of anything from President Putin. He said we should be more worried about China right now.
Unfortunately, it's typical for President Trump. He always sort of switches his rhetoric, tries to shift the rhetoric away from Russia onto China.
Why is that? Because he's got an election and he needs Russia's help in the election?
So a lot of people, of course, has been pointing out this possible some kind of affinity of Trump's to Putin. Rhetorically, it certainly looks this way because Trump really has been amazingly reluctant to in any way condemn Putin's regime. But I have to say that first of all, Pompeo did come out with a sort of a statement, right? Second of all, if you look at the policies by Trump administration, maybe that's not his own credit, but the policies against Putin has been more or less unified with the EU response in recent years. I have looked at that in depth. There were consequences after Skripal was poisoned. For example, there were heavy sanctions on Deripaska, remember, which actually crushed the Russian market, which were later lifted, unfortunately, but at the time they were quite significant.
Right, but the Magnitsky, Bill Browder's Magnitsky Act was passed in the US. It was passed in Canada. It's been passed now by Britain. Browder is saying, okay, this is the moment that the EU has to pass it now. Because if you don't increase sanctions against Russia, then, quote unquote, as Browder put it in a tweet, that Putin thinks he has a license to kill.
That's absolutely true. And just finish my discussion, I think that while Trump actually follows somewhat the sanctions policy that's also imposed by the EU, the effort there is actually to try probably to steal the hope to probably to negotiate with Russia against China. They're probably afraid to push Putin too much into China's hands. I think it's a little bit too late for it. I think Putin and the Kremlin is right now definitely negotiating with China because they understand that they're not going to be able to survive in power without certain type of Chinese help long term. So that's done the deal on the individual sanctions list. Yes, absolutely true. It's Bill Browder is absolutely correct. We need more sanctions, and there was an op-ed in New York Times recently that actually suggested to do something by like Navalny's list, similar to Magnitsky's list, the op-ed written by Brett Stevenson. That's all great, but I have to say that individual sanctions are important, but they're not what's going to fundamentally damage Putin's regime. The
So
very
what is
fact that
fundamentally going to damage the regime if that's the goal?
well, if that's the goal, of course, we need to, and by the way, that's the reason why the sanctions have not been that effective in the first place up until now, right? Because they were never very strong. The sanctions that were imposed in Russia were relatively soft, with certain exceptions, which didn't last for long. What we need is strong sectoral sanctions and broader, more stronger sanctions of Iranian type. So this some kind of developments on the German side and statements by Merkel and her closest officials that say that this might mean the end of Nord Stream 2. This is going to be painful.
Nord Stream 2 is a very long pipeline that is supposed to be, is 90% complete between Russia and Germany.
And has been frozen by a round of the US sanctions, by the way, in December 2019. But it's not over yet. And lately, Germany, that always been very supportive of this project, suddenly even German officials started saying that maybe Navalny poisoning is what's going to, and if it's not investigated, if there's no cooperation on the Kremlin side, maybe it will be the end of this project. This will be more painful. So individual sanctions are needed, but it's not at all what's needed. But then again,
I know I don't have unlimited time with you, and I do want to ask you about Belarus.
Of course.
Does some of this, do you think, we've already talked about the fact that Putin may have done this because he's worried about the problems in Belarus spreading to Russia, and that the protests could spread, and Navalny could be the driver of some of that. I have to say, look, we are weeks and weeks into, more than a month into Lukashenko's fraudulent election, and then his locking up and beating of people and torturing of people. It just seems to go from bad to worse. And now you have this Maria Kaselnikova, you can correct my pronunciation, but she's one of the main opposition leaders. She disappeared. She was snatched off the street. I mean, he's snatching people off the street, peaceful demonstrators. She has now been charged by the KGB after she wouldn't go to Ukraine. She wouldn't run from the country. She ripped up her passport. She has now been charged with trying to overthrow the government. I mean, it goes from bad to worse.
Well, absolutely true. Unfortunately, Lukashenko's regime is even more brutal and repressive than the current regime in Russia. This sort of repressions have been in place before, and which, if anything, only more highlights the incredible courage and commitment of Belarusian people who stay in the streets, who continue to protest despite all these brutal oppressions and the risks that they're facing. They're really mortal risks. And honestly, in my mind, I'm convinced that Lukashenko will not stop at anything. Like Putin, he understands that to him, leaving his throne is a direct path to Hague, right? To essentially to criminal justice and to ultimately to jail. And these leaders, therefore, will do anything in their power to stay. Because the risks are really.
Did you see his recent interview with Russian media? All very nicely staged, but He said that Belarus,
Mhm.
Belarus has strengthened the protection of state border in all directions, except for Russia, because of course he's courting Putin right now. Men hide behind women and children, like 75 years ago when the Nazis let women go ahead. Protests are controlled by USA, Poland, Czech Republic, Ukraine, and Lithuania.
Well, that's
Is that just good propaganda, or is he
of
mad?
course, and he's also he is saying anything in his power, right? We on Russia's Twitter, there are already bets being made. Who's he's going to accuse next? Everyone's waiting for Soros to be accused at some point. You know, Soros is this famous um, uh, person who has funded a lot of great initiatives in Europe, in Eastern Europe, but also treated by local autocrats as the big conspiracy figure behind any protests. Yeah, Lukashenko is off the rail at this point. He has nothing to lose. He definitely tried to side with Putin. He also tries to please Putin with in all his might. Remember his so-called leaked conversation between Mike and Nick, allegedly American security service officers who describe how to best essentially back protesters in Belarus and against
Right, again,
Russia.
suggesting this is all controlled from the outside and the protesters are
Typical
controlled. And,
narratives,
yeah.
typical autocratic narratives about this color revolution, allegedly inspired from
People don't seem to be
outside.
buying it though, Maria, in
What?
Belarus. They don't seem to be buying it. I mean, they're out in big numbers every single weekend and they are not being intimidated by him. It seems
That's what's
like
absolutely amazing.
it seems like they understand they were ripped off in the election
Oh,
and that's it. They're done with him. So how does
that's
that
absolutely
end?
amazing. This is a very good question. And first of all, I have to say that the reason why Lukashenko is so emboldened and why is he so unconstrained and unhinged is, as I said before, the very weak response of the Western community. Unfortunately, the West is in a trap somewhat. They're very much afraid to provoke Putin in a way that happened in Ukraine. So if they were to help protesters, they're afraid this actually is going to, if anything, trigger Putin to move his military into Belarus. But at the same time, it's also hard to stay and watch at this de facto genocide that's Lukashenko's implementing against his own people. And
Well,
at
genocide's a
least
pretty tough word.
it's a very strong word, but again, people were brutally killed and murdered, right? There's people who were who disappeared, and there's no question that once Lukashenko feels more confident, the huge repressions are going to follow against Belarusian people. And the response of the international community has been remarkably weak. The EU even refrained from sanctioning Lukashenko himself under the pretext that they still need to negotiate with him. So at least
But
sanctions
if
need
the
to be.
EU, and I'm sorry to jump in again, if the EU does not get tough on this guy, they have lost the plot, surely.
They asking or to your question, what's going to happen? Yeah, I think right now Putin is going to back Lukashenko. Putin is also wary of a possible example that any removal of Lukashenko right now may give to Russian people who, as we have discussed, are also increasingly unhappy with Russia domestically. There's also protests spreading in Russia. For example, there's a huge protest ongoing for over a month in Khabarovsk region.
That's in the Far East,
Um,
yeah.
in this sense, I think right now replacing Lukashenko would just serve an example that a democratic protest can succeed. Putin is definitely not ready to do anything like that. In the long term, however, I think the vast unpopularity of Lukashenko may incentivize, may essentially give Putin's elite some incentive to replace him and with a more Lukashenko with a more acceptable figure. But overall, however, the main outcome for Putin right now is definitely a success. Putin will use this as a pretext to deepen the Belarus-Russian Union, which also allegedly will allow Putin to stay in power in a more, nuanced, less direct way. Not because of the constitutional amendments, but as a new leader of this union state. Putin, as we know, has been pushing them for quite some time.
Yeah,
Lukashenko.
a lot of people are going to get lost in that sentence. But even as
Um,
far back as Yeltsin, they were talking about merge Belarus with Russia, have a new constitution, and that's how you get around this two-term limit, which there is no two-term limit in Russia now anyway, but that's how you get around the two-term limit because you have a new constitution, therefore the president can sit for another 2 terms. So what does Putin need that for? He just rammed through a referendum where he can stay there to 2036.
But the referendum has not been popular among Russians. You know, we know that so official, of course, here they put out the numbers that they wanted to, but unofficially, the electoral statisticians have estimated that up to 1/3 of Russians have actually voted against these constitutional amendments. They don't want Putin to stay indefinitely. They still think Russia is Europe. It needs to be at least somewhat democratic. So it's a very direct, brutal approach to stay in power. That's evident even to Russians as a very unclassy manipulation of the electoral legislation. In this sense, becoming the leader, the head of the Union state, however, will provide Putin with more legitimacy. Now Putin can portray himself as a person who, you know, repairs this historical injustice that's been done to the Soviet Union, sort of recreates this big Russian state, play on the imperialistic sentiments of many Russians, and again stop being the president of Russia, but now become this higher level leader. In this sense,
Vacuum up the near afar from whether it be in Ukraine or whether it be Belarus, or, and of course the Baltics are, you know, wide-eyed, and of course urging the EU, because they're part of the EU, that look, you don't understand Russia very well if you don't get tough with Putin now. So Maria Snegovaya from the Center of European Policy Analysis, I really appreciate your time. And if anybody, wants to understand what's going on in Eastern Europe, Maria Snegovaya, I think, is the best read there is. So thank you so much, Maria.
thank you so much, Daniel.